I think we're going to war for real.
I'll tell you one little story that I probably have never told anybody before.
We got hit with a NVA sapper company supported by infantry.
It's not easy, and that one was tough, but fortunately it worked out for us.
Welcome to War Stories, conversational military history. What's going on, everyone? Preston Stewart and Sayre Payne with War Stories, joined today by Doug Stanton. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So we were starting to go down rabbit holes of just rambling, and Doug suggested we hit record, which is a smart move. Before we get into anything, I do want to state my connections to Michigan, because I'll get in trouble if I don't. My wife and I lived in Grand Rapids for a period of time, and my in-laws, they all grew up in the Thumb, and my in-laws just recently moved to Tennessee from the Upper Peninsula, the Gawney.
Wow, that's
They're way up there.
Yeah. That's from eating what's called a pasty to catfish, you know, I mean.
I've been exposed to pasties now, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful area though, we were talking that.
It's great to be with you both, and congrats on your podcast. I'm really honored to be in your roster of guests. You know, I've been on the platforms and looked at what you're doing. You had a cool thing about the OSS a while ago, and a lot on Vietnam too, which I really applaud you for. So,
well, thank you very much. I'm excited to talk to you because I first came across your work with horse soldiers. We were talking about that just a second ago, but you've kind of bounced around between a couple different conflicts, which doesn't. I don't know. I guess I was going to say it doesn't seem that common, but that'd be a pretty broad statement. Your most recent work is on Vietnam, but your original book was, and I think there's a re-release coming out here shortly, World War II. So you kind of bounced between these different conflicts.
It's true. And I was never in the military, but I've spent 25 years writing about 3 conflicts. My dad was, my uncles were, my nephew is in 7th Group Special Forces. So I was a magazine writer growing up in the Midwest, and my editor called one day and he said, "Doug, you know that ship in Jaws?" Quint gives that great speech about the USS Indianapolis delivering the bomb, and and I said, Sid Evans at the time was the editor. That's just a made up story. He said, "No, they really exist. Why don't you go to Indianapolis and interview these veterans of World War II, these survivors at the hotel?" So I did. And that's how In Harm's Way was born. All that, you're right, there is a new edition. It's so interesting. This book came out in 2001. And I'm moving it too much to see it, but I just wrote a new chapter for it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What brought about that?
Number one, there was a couple of things I had to update. The ship was discovered by Paul Allen of Microsoft. He's since passed away, but they found it in a really huge research, and they didn't recover it, but they found the ship sinking on the bottom of the ocean. So finally, how the ship had sunk and where it was finally resting, because it's really the bookend of World War II. Pearl Harbor begins it. The Indianapolis is one of the last fatal actions of World War II. And the great irony, or the cosmic coincidence, is they delivered the atomic bomb, which is dropped on Hiroshima, which actually, while they're being convalescing in their hospitals, they learn about. And someone says, "Well, it's nuclear. It's a nuclear. What the heck is a nuclear bomb?" I mean, this is ships delivers basically the nuclear age into warfare, and it turned into a book. So the ship was discovered, but this is what's so interesting about this story. If you're not there to tell the story, and what you're doing is conversational war stories, if you don't collect these people around your campfire to tell their stories, they don't get recorded. You know, kind of what we're doing right now, what you're doing in your podcast is you're creating a communal story. Like if you knit it all together, Vietnam and OSS, and there's some common themes that go throughout it. There were more than 24 Black sailors aboard the Indianapolis. They all perished immediately in the torpedoing or shortly thereafter because they were bunked near the butter magazine. When the first survivors of the USS Indianapolis gathered in 1960 to reconsider what had happened to them. So you and I are talking right now, and suddenly, boom, the lights go out. we sync and we never see each other again.
Yeah.
You know,
Wow.
and you've come across these stories in with vets about the sense that the lights went out and they don't know how do they pick up the thread. So anyway, this happens to them in 1960, but because the black sailors were all killed, they never came to the reunions. And it was at the reunions that they began to rebuild the story. So, hey, Preston, I'm so glad to see you. I thought I killed you in the water. I thought I drowned you. I thought it went out of my head, jumped on you because you had an imaginary canteen, but you're alive. So, I mean, this is what happened. Yeah. And so if you can imagine the units you were in and you guys had something like happen to you, you come back together, all the questions you'd have of each other. But because the black sailors were not present and because the Navy at the time was an incredibly segregated society. I mean, not only were the black sailors segregated because of American society, they also had a whole different ranking or billeting aboard the ship. And anyway, I was privileged to interview their descendants who've come together, said, hey, Grandpa was on the ship, and they write a really fascinating history. So the book contains a lot of their story to be continued in a book that they're writing. But I thought it was really important that we, you know, when I was interviewing the guys, some of them said there were no black sailors aboard the ship. You know, and
that becomes lost. You're right. You're absolutely right. It's all derived from the firsthand account. And I think we all know how bastardized that gets the further you get from the mouths and from the eyeballs that were there.
Exactly. So there are 1,000 stories, you know, I mean, not like this one, but I mean, each voice is important, you know, and you try to capture them. And so I feel the book is more complete now with the experience of these folks in it. So that's it's
an interesting part of war where I get tricked into thinking that we have the full story from all these different events. But there's stories that just plain aren't told, whether, you know, part of that might've been some of the racial issues at the time, and other stories that just can't be told because that whole platoon got killed or that whole ship went down and they're gone. And it's like a weird thing to come to terms with, that we don't know that story. We never will. There's not like a missing piece of evidence.
Right.
So it's nice that you're starting to hear some of these through the descendants, which I imagine would have been kind of their experiences on the ship beforehand, what they were living throughout the war.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's Dory Miller who won the at Pearl Harbor, who jumped on the gun and saved the day. He was on Indianapolis. He would have been sunk actually, but I think he was on a bond tour when it went down. But aside from him, we don't really have much experience of the black sailor aboard Indianapolis. And anyway, it's a story about what it means to be a citizen. I think the story of the USS Indianapolis, selflessness versus selfishness. And we've all seen it in everyday life and probably in your own active duty, you know, so.
I think, I mean, to me, I think that is the story, right? And when we go, Preston and I always bounce back like the title War Stories, because it's like that to me sort of denotes Rambo type stuff, mowing people down or whatever. But it's the human experience part of it, right? And that's, I think it's hard to put at least from my perspective, to put a name or a label on that. And, you know, I was reading, I really like it's on your website when it says, Stanton says that he writes and talks about existential moments when ordinary men and women are forced to adapt and make extraordinary decisions at the least likely moment. That's when change happens, whether you like it or not. And because these are just everyday citizens like you're talking about, right? They went from one just being a kid playing baseball in the Midwest or growing up in the South or whatever their experience was as a young adult to now all of a sudden being in the middle of these sort of life-changing events that are really done by 18 to 25-year-olds, give or take. When out here in, like, let's say regular society, the real big deciders and the movers and shakers a lot of times are those names at the very top of that order, right? That they're a lot older, they've been around forever, they're the generals essentially. But it's in the trenches where all these ordinary people are doing these extraordinary things. And so for you to kind of get this on paper and tell that story, because let's be honest, in 1960, I don't think America wanted to read about the black sailors, right? It's just at that time, that story, nobody wanted to listen to it. As unfortunate that is, that is the reality. And so for you to still be able to tell it, even if it is later, it's an important piece of American history. It is American history.
Yeah, absolutely. And plus, the question is who's left behind? Like when a soldier dies, it's the family left. It's the family of the survivors. So how do each of our families, if we were to have someone lost in a combat, how do they go on? What's the story they tell themselves? We all need a story to get through the day, right? Sometimes we hope it's true.
Mm-hmm.
and so we tell these narratives. And I think one of my jobs, I wasn't in the military, but I have found that as a subject matter, and plus, let's face it, since 2001, it's been one of these stories in the headlines: conflict, conflict, conflict. I have an 18-year-old son. He's grown up with thinking all that. My job is, I think, or what I've tried to do is make you forget it's about combat and make you just think about the human heart, the soul in the journey, going through the cauldron of this experience. How are they changed? How do people relate? Are there lessons from that we can draw? Not that, it's in war there are equivalents to war. It doesn't have to be war, but I mean, it's that kind of story as opposed to bombs and bullets and people blowing up. I tell you, there's a funny story about horse soldiers. I was interviewing a guy named Mike Elmore, who was the weapons sergeant on ODA 595, one of the first teams into Afghanistan, October 2001. And he goes, I can't tell you how much our batteries weighed. And I'm like, batteries, Mike? This was in 2003. Mm-hmm. He goes, yeah, if I tell you the batteries, then the enemy will know, because they're still fighting over there in Afghanistan.
Sure.
How many calories we have to consume on our logistics train to carry that weight of the battery. He is thinking in such granular detail. I said, Mike, I could care less about the battery. Who wants to read about the batteries? I want to know what you did sitting in the cave, looking at the Taliban line and thinking about what was going to happen. He goes, oh, well, I was drawing Led Zeppelin album covers in my notebook. I said, bingo, that's the detail we want, because that is who the American soldier is at that moment. That is a detail we can relate to. And so my job is to put you in those shoes as a human being, as a neighbor, as a citizen, and then just experience what they've experienced. So we have some empathy and understanding of what other people have gone through. But
you talked about the selfishness versus selflessness during the Indianapolis. And I was wondering if you could get into that a little bit, just because at a really high level, the ship is sunk. Some people survive, some people don't. And there's some sketchy circumstances around it, maybe in terms of they should have been found earlier and all of that. But every single person has a different story, a unique story. They might have been wounded before they ended up in the water. They might have had to find their way out from under deck somehow. They might have been trying to take care of somebody who was wounded. And if they let go, he was going to drown. And that's not even getting into the shark piece of it. Yeah, would you just mind getting into that selfishness versus selflessness that you saw during some of that research?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, it's the struggle we all have, right? I mean, our own personal dreams, wants, needs for our families, plus our public responsibilities. Like what should the three of us do that's good for our community? And how is that ever in conflict with, well, hell, I got to get to work and I can't do that, or that's not for me, or I don't have time, or I don't care. In the Indianapolis story, everyone sinks pretty quickly, like in 12 minutes. It's the middle of the night. They're dropped into the water, some in life vests, some in K-POC vests, and then life rafts, and some on floater nets. And they think, well, I'm going to be rescued. Let's just say it's Monday. It's a Monday through Friday ordeal. That's the best way to think about it. And pick your favorite interstate. It's like if you left right now and got in the car and said, I'm going to drive to see my buddy, and you never showed up. They think, well, I'm a flat tire. I'm sitting here. They know I had to take I-75. They'll come looking for me.
Sure.
Where else? They never come because they're on a main shipping lane, and they think, well, if they're not here now, they don't even know we've sunk. So now it's Tuesday. Then it becomes Wednesday. It's like, man, how far are we going to hang? How long can we hang out here? You know what? They're not coming at all. Everyone around me is dying. Sharks are picking off a lot of guys. Some people are starting to suffer from the physiological apocalypse of this whole thing, which is no water, sunstroke, sun blindness. What's the point? And some guys began to swim away, and many succumbed because they had no, from the wounds, as you said, Sayre. But what I noticed in my interviews, remember, this is anecdotal, so I want to make a general section of veterans or in this traumatic situation, but
Sure.
the guys, they're all young. They're 19 to 21, some are 17, that kind of banded together and forgot about the self and just said, you know what, we're going to hang in here as long as we can as a group. If they were lucky enough to survive, came out with a different sense of who they were. Like they apprehended. It was like, I wouldn't say it was a spiritual experience, although some of the guys did recount that, but it was a scalding experience.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that happened in this was some of them heard voices, and I've talked about this before. About to swim away, Ed Brown from California, his buddies, like, they're looking at the water, it's totally flat. And they're singing Yellow Rose of Texas, I mean, the sun is out, they could see into the water, see the sharks circling. I mean, it's one of those placid days at sea. Seems very benign, but remember the water's like 86, you're 90, what, 96.8 degrees. So they're hypothermic. And his buddy says, Ed, I'm out of here. And he takes off his vest and swims away. And Ed's about to take off too. And he hears a voice, and it's his dad's voice. You're Ed Brown, mow the yard, do your homework, go to football practice. Really, really simple stuff. Like this, it wasn't philosophy, but when I traveled around on a book tour, I noticed that a lot of guys were saying this, like, man, I saw so-and-so leave, and I thought, but boy, I thought about my mom or my teacher or my coach, and I remember something they said to me, and they stopped and they didn't go away. And then I realized that this isn't about selfishness and selflessness, but it is about us, the readers, saying, what did I say today to anybody in a moment like that they might grab onto?
Oh.
So ultimately, I think a lot of these stories that you talk about on this show and stories I try to write about, really about citizenship. Because if you boil that down, that means what kind of neighbor are we? What kind of citizen are we? Each one of those young men, remember, they're young. One of them was a little older than 16. He's basically, illegally wangled his way onto the ship.
It's a kid. Yeah.
He's a kid. They come out of this, and now they got the rest of their life to live. And they would say things like, I've not really had a bad day since I got out of the water. But in that moment, when they hear that voice, it's kind of like they're pinned. You remember a teacher you had in school, or anybody who just made you feel like, wow, I'm better than the C student I really am. That it's just that kind of, I think the current term lately would be to be seen.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's, in the old-fashioned sense of 1945, I think that's what happened in the water. And that, to me, was a very moving discovery as a writer.
It's a lot of it is, part of it is that confidence game where it comes in, that whole fake it till you make it sort of thing, is where I think I can, I know I can.
Right.
And you can do that on the individual level, going through the training, right? You got to prove yourself to make it through all that stuff as an individual, but then it's other people on the ground then that help keep it alive, keep that spirit alive. It doesn't have to be an officer or a sergeant. It could be anybody cracking jokes even, right? Just, it could be the 16-year-old. And it's contagious in a good way. Just like fear is contagious, right? Because that's the counter to it. That's what you're fighting, is that the natural fear, I feel like, and it could go so many different ways. I remember my colonel in ROTC, he was always, and he was very happy. He always had this smile on his face, very happy, outgoing. I remember him telling us, like my senior year, right before we commissioned, he's like, look, you gotta put the leader face on. And because you don't want to show up. He said, I don't want to show up here. I don't want to be here. It's like Monday, my kids, I'm having problems. And he's being honest with us because we never saw that side of him. And because our perception of him was like, he just didn't complain about things. And it was just interesting to think that, like, just by him sort of being present and cheering us up and motivating us, it just literally to watch this sort of compound interest. And again, I'm talking college, not wanting to wake up early in college, totally different scenario than what they had to go through and face. But to me, it's sort of that same principle, though, like to think that how in the world could the human spirit stay alive in that scenario that you're describing, where you look around and see nothing. You waited and thought your buddies would come, and they didn't. And in fact, what did come were sharks. Mm-hmm. And the sun isn't going away. There's no water supply. How in the world can a human being maintain sort of that spirit and composure or confidence? Because you have to have confidence in the future if you're going to continue to fight and not just swim away and just sink, just die. Why? What is the point? That's what you mentioned. And go ahead.
Yeah, this is why I think there are lessons in these stories. Giles McCoy, one of the people in harm's way, he was at one of the almost 1,200 crew members, 300 and some survived. He said, I'm not going to give up, but I'll hang in here as long as I can. Like, his sense of the future kind of got really small, but you learn to live within that. So I don't know. I just think, well, okay, if you're facing, if you're facing trying to pay the bills, or you're trying to make it through COVID, I mean, there's a lot of ways to really think about how so much of life is mental, the mental game. And I mean, as we're talking right now, I'm really thinking, okay, we're talking about this, but you talk about selflessness and courage. Think about the men and women in the steel plant in Ukraine.
Sure.
I mean, how in the world do you keep going on? That esprit. Anyway, I'm kind of drifting off topic here, but I think we're talking about courage, about sacrifice, about self-awareness,
Well, I have a question, Doug. How do you, in an event like the Indianapolis, where you can get into very graphic, traumatizing events, and I think there's sometimes a need for that to really relay what these men were going through. I mean, they weren't just sitting out in the water waiting for 3 days. That would be challenging by itself. But there's all these other aspects to it that are catchy, maybe not in a good way. How do you walk that line between relaying the graphic nature of what these men were enduring, but not just gratuitously?
So it's like between going macabre,
sure,
and just kind of telling, the facts. Well, one rule is, like, if you're talking with someone around their kitchen table, like in Tampa, Florida, when I was doing a lot of these interviews, and they start to disclose this stuff and talk about it, then I know that it's something they processed and they're willing to disclose. So that would be my first ruler. It's interesting. The book, the sharks are there. They're only in one chapter. And the ship blows up and there are a lot of injuries. But what people tell me about the book is that they keep turning the pages because of it's not the action, but how are these guys going to make it? How are they going to survive? So I think the Vietnam book is maybe a better book, before I get to that later, about asking about what is quote, gross or, really graphic versus, what just putting on the page what you need to know to understand this the gravity of the situation.
We can go into that one, but Sayre and I are 101st guys. So if I'm not mistaken, it was about Echo 1501.
Yeah, it was. You're right. Okay. So you're at Fort Campbell.
I was, yeah.
Yep.
So horse soldiers felt a little more like home. I wasn't there until a couple of years after, but
I was there a lot, man. I stayed at the Country Inn and Suites off exit 4.
Yeah,
Came on
very well.
Came onto the gate and got my pass, and then started walking around all the team rooms to interview the 5th group guys.
Yeah,
it's a nice base. I like it.
Yeah, it is. And the 101st Airborne, of course, is there. And if you want, I don't want to jump over because I don't think I really addressed your question. It was like, how do you be graphic and still honest? Is that?
Yeah, without being overly so, but I think it sounds like you've got a better way of addressing that than I was.
Okay. Yeah, because it's interesting. We'll move on from In Harm's Way, but Holt, the publisher, just released a young readers edition of the book because there's so many high school students who are reading it. Have become homework for these kids, and typically I would try to answer them if they would track me down. And so they just published like a version for 9 to 14-year-olds. And oddly, they didn't change a whole lot. The language is a little different. We tougher with the Vietnam book. I'm in Afghanistan, researching horse soldiers at Bagram, in a Chinook helicopter, trying to go to the Pakistan border to hang out for a week with an SF group to see how they operate in country. Because remember, I'm writing history, but I want to see how this really works in the real world.
What year is this? What time frame?
Well, I went there twice, 05 and 10.
Okay. Oh.
And we never got out of the Indiana National Guard was flying the Chinooks. And they had no instruments. They had what's that called? Line of sight.
Oh gosh,
visual.
Sure depends.
Yeah. I mean, there was fog over this pass, and because they didn't have the instruments, we couldn't fly through it because they would lose visual.
Sure.
So all we did all day was go up and down, trying to go forward. And the air ops guy running the show was a guy named Stan Parker, who must have been, I have to ask Stan, 50, 55 at the time. And he was still in uniform. And he said, "Did you write this book, In Harm's Way, about World War II?" Because he'd read it. And I said, "Yeah, I did." He goes, "Man, would you ever write about Vietnam?" I'm like, "Why? Were you there?" He goes, "Yeah, I was there." I said, "But wait, you're still in the Army?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm in Special Forces." And he's command sergeant major, and he just been moved over to run air ops at Bagram. And he's kind of assigned to watch me and take care of me for the day and make sure I got to where I wanted to go. And we just began a discussion in that helicopter about Vietnam. And that was 2005. In 2012, I went to the U.S. Air Force Academy and gave a talk. And he lives in Colorado Springs, and he showed up, and we reunited that many years later, and I started the book, and we ended up going back to Vietnam with him.
Just a random connection in Afghanistan. You didn't know him prior to that assignment necessarily?
No, but he saw something in Harm's Way that he thought I could be someone who would tell us, again, just a slice of the Vietnam story. It does not talk about the 101st in general. It doesn't really talk about all of Echo Company. I mean, It really is his story and his buddies. And it was a hard story to tell because, I mean, there's so many things I don't know what you've experienced is on your podcast, talking to guys about Vietnam, but it's America's greatest unfinished story. Mm-hmm. There's no period at the end of the sentence. When it comes to Vietnam.
Right.
And it's a shame. Mm-hmm. We still don't have the language to talk about it. we can talk about 9/11 now in a very articulate way. But when you ask a lot of guys, if you see a guy who's 75 years old walking around, he's probably thinking about Vietnam at least once a week, right? If you really think about it, or once a day. And so why is he thinking about it? It goes to your question, Preston, because man, the combat was just so hairy and it was nonstop, 24/7. In World War II, you know, you'd go forward and come back. Well, you've talked to enough guys on the show, but so that what they saw was just, you know, and it was all about the body count. Have you ever talked about moral injury on the show with any of these guys? Like, I know you had Sebastian Younger on, and he talks about moral injury. And
we haven't used that term, but I think we've gotten into it.
Yeah.
I go ahead and explain it, because it's to me a new term in a way that I probably wasn't aware of even a few months ago. And so, yeah, how are you using it in this context of Vietnam?
So there's I'm drawing a blank. There's a writer that Sebastian would know. And Sebastian has been a guest of ours at the National Writer Series once or twice. You got to look him up. Moral injury. He's a psychologist out of Boston. It's where, Sayre, you and I are in combat, and we do something that we know is morally wrong, but we've been asked to do it by command or by our country. And so we come home and we've suffered this injury. We cannot jibe the rightness and the wrongness of it. And we never come together on it. And that's why you see guys and women with trauma and with problems, you know, trying to, aside from just the fact that loud noises might bother them, or, you know, it's a real thing.
I think it goes on to your not finished. They don't have the period at the end of the sentence is the same almost to me as like the question that have gone unanswered. And I don't know if it's just Vietnam. I mean, I could say that about Afghanistan. It's that ultimate question of what was the point, right? Yeah. And you get that from Vietnam guys, and I do explain to that, you know, and we hear that a lot. And my answer to that, just from my perspective at least, is I can't speak on the country, but I think I learned from you, you know, right. Like listening to, you know, what happened in Vietnam as a kid and trying not to, you know, the body counts and all that stuff. We try to learn all those lessons learned, because the last thing you want to do, whether you're on Indianapolis or whatever, is like go through these hard suffering things that you do and have no benefit. Nothing occur out of that. Is just, well, that probably is the moral injury, maybe part of it in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting show for you guys. I'll come back on and interview you about how you feel about Afghanistan, because when we can get to come back to horse soldiers, the guys I was talking to that were in SF were depressed in August of 2021. I mean, sure. I called one of them up who'd won the Distinguished Service Cross. He goes, I don't know how to talk about this. I do not know how to talk about the last 20 years or the last 17 of my career. I think what we learned from Vietnam is to separate the war from the soldier. Right. So I'll give you a quick example. Stan Parker comes home from Vietnam, lands in California, takes off his uniform and kind of tries to hide out. He's coming back from Afghanistan, and the pilot comes on the plane, says, "We have on board Stan Parker today, returning from Afghanistan." He's flying back to the States. And the captain starts to clap for him. And he's like, he goes, and we have a gentleman up here in first class who'd like to give a seat up for Mr. Parker. And Stan's like looking around. He didn't want to get up. And he actually walks, this is in the book, The Odyssey of Echo Company. He's walking forward in the plane. He said, "Man, they didn't do this a while ago. I kind of understand why, but would they still be clapping for me if they knew I was in Vietnam too?" You know, so even in that moment, it's that moral injury. And by that, Preston, it goes to just the body count. That was a tough thing in the Odyssey of Echo Company. There was just, when you're fighting to kill bodies and that's your metric of success, as opposed to a symmetrical advance taking ground, and achieving a strategic objective. That seems to be what troubled a lot of guys. And so when you write that scene, firefight afterwards, and there's just bodies piled everywhere, how do you write that? So just the question is light touches, so that the reader doesn't feel you're kind of reveling in the gore.
Right.
But it's got to be enough so that you can see why the guy is messed up about it.
Sure.
So it's
I've never thought of it in that sense, and a lot of things you said just kind of piecing together in my head. But the concept in previous conflicts where there's killing done to liberate a village, to take a beach, and you can then weigh it personally on the individual level. Was pulling the trigger against that other human being worth it to take this objective? But if you're going out and the focus is body count and you kill 10 people, you get to come home and say, I killed 10 people because it was 10 people. And I think we all have something in us to a degree that says killing is wrong. And that would be, I've never thought of it that way. That would be very, very hard to square.
Right. I mean, you were in Afghanistan, your job was to, a lot of things, create the ANA and to train people and to take ground, right? And create safe ink spots around the country where that's totally different, and I just, I think the Odyssey of Echo Company is it's probably my better written book in a way. It's more interesting, but boy, it was a harder book to get the public to pay attention to. And that's just because the way we think about Vietnam.
They just don't want to hear it. There's something about it where they'd rather not hear it. Not even if they're not interested. It's just like, I just don't want to, those are waters I don't want to tread.
So I convinced Stan Parker to go back to Vietnam. Now, a lot of vets have done that. It's an interesting journey. And it forms, there's a video on my website or on YouTube about this moment, because I was filming it and my wife was there, my brother-in-law were taking pictures, and we're driving around, and since Stan was a command sergeant major, he's got a map, and he's reading it and the grid coordinates, and he goes, no, this is it. This is the village where I was. And it was just a very small settlement. He goes, this is it. So van stops. You know how when you open a van, sometimes the door will slide back, clunk, and the van's still moving. The van's still moving. He hops out. He gets out, takes a couple steps, takes another step over this brush, and then he freezes. And he's in the rice paddy where he got shot, so many years ago. He's like standing literally because he had described it to me and we'd drawn a map. He goes, this is it. I said, what, Stan? And he goes, this is where it all happened. And he starts to have a flashback. And I just put my hand on his shoulder and one of the things you don't want to do, you can't fix this. But I think what I would almost said, I think what veterans want, but I think what all of us want is just for people to listen to us and take our feelings seriously in that moment. So he's having this moment, and I'm just standing there witnessing it. And he kind of stops, and then we begin to walk around, and he starts to narrate, and I'm filming, and I'll jump ahead, but about, I don't know, an hour later, a gentleman comes walking down this little path, Mr. Sin, and it turns out Stan had narrated how he'd come across this paddy, he'd been shot at, he dropped down, he lifted up a law and he shot it across the road, which is now our van was parked on, and blew up a house, which is really a command bunker for the Viet Cong cadre in town. And the guy walking down the street was Mr. Sin. He had been the leader of the Viet Cong cadre. And it was Stan's house that he blew up. And so we're looking at the map, and on our translator, who's married to a former Marine, and they both lived in Vietnam. And so we're pretty certain of language and about where we're at. He hands the map to Mr. Sin, and he immediately orients it to the north. So he knows that this guy's he knows how to read a map too. And Stan starts to say, were you here? Were you here? And he goes, yeah, oh yeah. He goes, well, we came in at 10 a.m. and it started to rain. And he said, no, it rained at 11 a.m. And then they start to fill, okay, like in the Indianapolis story, they start to fill in the details. And in fact, at one point, Mr. Sin holds out his palm and he starts, because Stan gets airlifted out of there. He does get shot and medevac, and the helicopter gets shot down about a kilometer away again. And he's saying, well, I got out of here and I was shot down. And then Mr. Sin in his palm starts drawing the race petty where he got shot down. So it's clear that they are on the same page. And a couple of things struck me is Mr. Sin was living alone in this village, and he walked over to some brush and cleared it away. And there was like an obelisk, like a cement, and it was a monument to the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese who'd been killed in that village, and the Americans too, during that battle, which is really small skirmish and firefight. And it occurred to me that the only two people in the world who really had thought about this the most were the two enemies, Sin and Parker. And Mr. Sin, because he had been fighting for the VC, he gets captured and then he starts fighting for the South Vietnam. And then when the MVA win, he then gets thrown into re-education camp. I mean, the guy couldn't win. His whole life was, and when you go to Vietnam, which I highly recommend for a lot of people, the young people just have moved on. They don't think about the war. And so Mr. Sin himself didn't have a lot of people to talk to about it. And so these two guys were walking around arm in arm, completely unstructured, and totally different people. Stan was a hardened combat soldier. He was not a butterfly, but here he was. So anyway, it was amazing.
I have this, like, I very much enjoy hearing accounts from World War II veterans because we don't have a lot of those left. And it's that first person documentation that's so important. But anytime I hear a story from a Vietnam veteran, I don't know, it makes me want to focus more on the conflict because it feels like they've been done wrong. But I don't know what to do with that information. I don't know if there is anything to do with it. Maybe it's listening. Maybe it's writing a book and telling these stories that haven't been told, but I don't know.
It's listening. I give you, if you want to, at another point, Stan Parker is shot down out of yet another helicopter, and he's thrown from it and he's wounded, and he is convinced that a being, a person, a body helped pick him up and walk him to another helicopter to get him out of there. He's convinced. He alternately calls it an angel or something, but I think in his heart, he knows it's not true. But he doesn't quite know how he got to the helicopter. But if he does think it's true, that's fine with me. And what I learned in writing this book was to sit there and listen, because unlike in other reporting, if I had said to him, you're wrong or you're full of it, it would have shut everything down. And the point of the story is to figure out how he's coped with it. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. Most of us don't believe in angels picking us up off the battlefield and walking us to helicopters. But he, in that moment, that's what his life and psyche needed. And so you're right. It's just, you print that, and there are other instances of just, standing there and listening.
What I sort of, I guess, enjoy or like to hear is when we're talking to someone and they start talking and or thinking about a memory that they haven't thought about for 40, 50 years in sort of their life. Because again, they don't get asked a question. So they don't a lot of times have the opportunities to sort of, because you mentioned it, it's in the mind and you're thinking about it probably every day. Honestly, I'm sure something comes up in your mind. It does for me pretty much. But but now they have the opportunity to sort of like say the thought, and you kind of have to explain what the heck you're just saying, because it's probably pretty crazy. Whatever it is that you went through, it's probably pretty wild. And now you got to sort of connect those pieces out loud and put it together. And now it just keeps kind of creating these new sparks of memory that were kind of tucked way back in the back of the mind, because what's the point of bringing it up when nobody even has any idea what the heck I'm talking about?
You just put it out there, your show, my books, what the people you interview, you just for a moment give voice to the unsaid, you know, and I think it all adds up to something. You're trying to create, for me, trying to create wholeness out of, I mean, there's nothing more chaotic than combat. Well, I'm sure there is, but I mean, let's just talk about, and what my experience was, most men and women want to figure out what the hell happened to them. Beginning, middle, and end, you know, make sense out of nonsense.
Connect the dots.
Yeah, connect the dots, like you said. So.
And what's kind of add on what Sayre was saying there, something that I think is really cool is we've had people who have heard other veterans tell stories and they've reached out to say that connected. So maybe they couldn't, I'm sure there's Vietnam veterans who have read your book that's not their story, but it pieced together enough for them to do something, to mean something. That's really cool.
Yeah, and you can you'll meet authors, and I guess I'm one of them. Like I was doing a book signing in St. Louis, and interestingly, young women and the granddaughters and the daughters of these veterans in the Army that was typically male will come to a book signing and say, "Do you think this is what happened to Grandpa?" Like with the Vietnam book, and I said, "Well, it might be close." And boy, then they would start really. Then they often would start to cry. Because they realized, this is what he's been carrying. So they would write, you read it, and I think, you know, listen, just use the book as an opportunity to start a discussion. I was giving a talk at Chautauqua, New York, which is a summer lecture series, and I was talking about the Odyssey of Echo Company, and I'd given a reading, and it was just normal question and answers, and then suddenly this man stood up in a three-piece suit at the microphone, and out of nowhere he said, "I was in Vietnam, and I hope one day all of you stop hating me." And no one in the audience had said, "We hate you." And I thought, here's this man coming from a boardroom or whatever corporate world, and yet underneath this, he's carrying this. That is not good for our society. I mean, that is, think of all the things we could do if we could harness and redirect that energy that's spent holding that story in, you know? And so, but I'm glad he said it, right? I mean, he got up, and there must have been some moment where he was glad that he was able to say that in front of people. And everyone, of course, said, "We don't hate you." And he sat down. So
I could not imagine that generation where all of the adult males in their lives, for the most part, right? Their dads, their uncles, they've been deified with World War II, which is like the perfect war. It's not, so many wars are gray, but this is a black and white war, good versus evil. I mean, the Nazis, come on. And so they rose to the call out of the Depression and defeated them. And then they shut up about it. And I wonder, part of that is maybe they didn't have to talk because so many did. Everybody told their story. Everybody did. You didn't have to be a veteran to tell your story. Well, in Vietnam, I'm going to say there's no market for it, right? There's no interest. That's because there's no interest, in the sense the ears don't want to hear it. And so now they are the ones who are supposed to tell their story. It puts them in a very uncomfortable situation when they grew up as children, trying to be their dads, right? And be these figures that they sort of idolized. And then they did the job. They did everything that was asked of them by their nation and the people that elected those leaders, they did it. And then it was like, not even that you do it for credit, I don't think, but it goes back to that ultimate question. Well, what was the point?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are 2 points. One, your country asks you to do it. So that's, but that's the simple point. And then in the end, what do you accomplish? So it's 1965 or 66 when Stan kind of starts to think about Vietnam. So the war, World War II, has only been over for 20 some years, right?
Sure.
And you're true. His dad was a bomber crew, but okay. So it's 2022. It'd be like if suddenly we were going to have a draft for Ukraine. I'm not suggesting that, but 9/11 is just 20 years in our rearview mirror. And although we've just ended Afghanistan last August. So, I mean, we're not that far. We forget how close.
Yeah.
How close World War II was to Vietnam. There are some good reporting. Oh, Sayre, I want to point out about World War II, and I don't remember the author's name. Oh, you know what? She teaches at West Point. She teaches a class at West Point about combat, the history of conflict, and she starts to reassess World War II. You're right; it is the good war, but she goes a little deeper, and I think it's important to note that because. We've talked about the moral injury of the Vietnam vet, but man, did you ever see the movie or the TV show Mad Men? Or did you ever hear about the 3 Martini lunch? I mean, why do you think these people in the 50s were blasted out of their brains by 2 p.m. because they were anesthetizing themselves after the war? And it was a dirty, ugly thing as well. But yeah.
I should really, I know I'm generalizing.
I know you are.
But I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but my main thesis and premise behind all of that was that deification was actually to our detriment. Even calling them our greatest generation denotes that's the peak. Greatest, that's it, right? That means nobody will be greater than that. So all subsequent generations, and especially their children, they're even titled, 70 some grown adults that are grandparents, some great grandparents are still identified in America as babies of this greatest generation. They are the baby boomers. They have always been tied to in this great generation that came out of the Depression to defeat the Nazis. And there were no bad stories told. It was all good. And so we know that there is bad, but that sort of godlike status, I think maybe in the end is harmful because we can be just as good. We're all ordinary citizens, right? That can rise to they were ordinary citizens. We're all ordinary citizens just trying to, good versus evil, sure. But, it's the progress of our, just America, how it's aged and everything, right? Times change, of course.
She would be an interesting guest. And I'm sorry, I can't blank on her from West. And here's it. The question is, people say, well, do you like war, Doug? You've written 3 books about it. And I'm like, no, I don't like war. But I mean, Elmore Leonard was Get Shorty, and he's a friend of ours. He's recently passed on, also from Michigan. But no one ever asked Elmore, do you like bank robbery? Are you a fan of crime, Elmore? No, it just, he found within it a frame and a lens by which you could talk about larger issues in society. And but here's the thing I think about a lot lately, especially with Ukraine and Putin. Why do we have to kill people to create change? I mean, okay, I'm not afraid to ask the stupid question, right? I mean, it's the obvious stupid question, but it is the question. And what would be interesting is to do a subset of the podcast called Peace Stories. Like, wouldn't it be cool to figure out, people come on the show and brag about like a Jedi Knight, they resolved the conflict without firing a bullet. And that's kind of what interested me in horse soldiers. I don't know, do you guys want to talk about the SF unconventional war model for a moment?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, because it goes to the Jerry Bruckheimer movie, 12 Strong, which became an action picture with Chris Hemsworth. But horse soldiers is, the reason I kind of lit up on the OSS guest you had is the special forces groups were really the descendants of OSS officers in World War II. So in 2001, these group of, let's just say it's 24 to 36 to 48 people, and then followed by thousands, dropped behind enemy lines to work with locals, get them to stop fighting. The three of us here we're bickering. I've stolen Preston's motorcycle, and Sayre, you own something of mine, and all we're doing is fighting each other. But yet down the road, there's one person who's really trying to beat up on all of us. So the SF comes in and gets all three of us to stop fighting with each other, point in one direction, and fight the Taliban.
Mhm.
And it worked. It worked. In 2002, the objective actually, that's why I don't want to end this conversation without pointing out that America did achieve its objective in 2002, right?
Mhm.
It was really impressive too. Very,
You're
very
right.
impressive.
It was cheap. It was early. The collateral damage on the battlefield was very small because the only people out in the open were the Taliban. I mean, it was a different war. What I write about was completely different than what you guys deployed into.
Mhm.
And but they were trained, they dine out on the idea of never firing a shot. There's a story I heard about one major or colonel who was working in Latin America and walked into a guerrilla camp unarmed. He spoke Spanish. He understood the cultural mores. He knew who was fighting who. He knew all that stuff, like if we were to come into the room together. And he walked in and just talked to the guy and said, what would it take for you to stop fighting us? And so they had this discussion, and they put down their arms. No, they got something in return, but you see what I mean? That the whole UW unconventional war model is not necessarily a bunch of door kickers.
Sure.
It's not what you know is going Connecticut, like there's soft power.
Right.
So it's just really, but so that that's hard to make into an action movie. But because if you see in 12 Strong, Chris Hemsworth and the actor, a wonderful actor playing General Dostum, are talking a lot. It's like, but to their credit, they did not make it into a Rambo movie,
Right.
or a SEAL movie.
They're
Yeah.
reading a lot on their spare time, and they're learning. That's the scholar warrior piece of what those
Right.
guys did. And
Right.
we just spoke with a couple of weeks ago, like Henry Hooper, who was a Green Beret medic in like 63 going in, and like,
Wow.
it's
early.
the same mentality that he was in before Gulf of Tonkin type thing in Vietnam. And to hear him describe that mantra and philosophy of, his job was to provide medical care to these villages that just had very rudimentary provisions. It wasn't there to kill people. It was, we can use hearts and minds as if we just focus on that as a result and strategy, we'll be miserable. He was actually there just to do good. That's what it sounds from me talking to him. He was just trying to help these people. It wasn't about the killing aspect. And that is how the Green Berets were developed.
Right. By, with, and through, working with the community. So I brought that up because ultimately you're trying to, it's all political in the end. And so I'm just raising this for the audience. Like, do we ever get to a point in civilization where we decide we don't going to blow things up to force? But what happened? So you've got Putin doing what he's doing. How else do you respond to it? I'm asking you.
Well, I think I agree. I think war, when we start killing, it's the worst of mankind. But
Right.
I genuinely think the way that we ever get past that, I know that's a pipe dream, is the individual stories like you're telling. It's not the geopolitics. It's not big picture strategic or operational moves on the battlefield. It's the individual and what they feel, because we can relate to that. And I can't relate to a general moving troops across France in World War II.
Right.
Personal take. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's what I would say, the big picture. It has improved, and we are fighting with words more than we are with bullets at the end of the day. As long as World War III doesn't happen, if this has all just been, this great peace has been a lead up to a giant pressure valve release, probably a bad day for everybody. But going back to, I do think that some people have a mentality, and I probably felt it at times in the military, I'm sure I did, of the good old days of war. Back when we had to have war rations and bonds, war bonds, and where the government didn't even have enough money, they had to borrow it from the people, and victory gardens because of the supply chain management, and basically all the males in your young males in your family just going off until you don't know when, and 500,000 people dying as a result of that. Vietnam, vast improvement, right? And if we're just going off KIA type stuff, we went from 500,000 to less than 60,000. At least on that front, it's a win. We didn't need to sacrifice and tighten our belts. That's probably a good thing, I think. We still had the draft and all of that, but no nuclear bombs at least went off and those sort of things. And we weren't mass bombing campaigns, even though civilians did die. It still, I don't think, was to the degree of when we were bombing, when Europe was being bombed in the factories, and Japan, and both sides doing that sort of stuff. Different type of war. And then flash forward to our war, no draft. I think that's a win. 20 years, longest war, United States history. Yeah, not great, but casualty wise, a lot better. Did people care about it as much? No, probably not. But again, that's probably, I'm viewing that as a win in the sense that all these prior generations before us who fought wars have lessened it for us younger people who had to end up doing it later. And it wasn't as, and then for the American people themselves, that impact was even less on the home front. And I would think that is at least some sort of measurement of success for their, sacrifices that they made.
It's true. If we'd had a draft, though, I wonder if we would have been out of Afghanistan sooner. I mean, I mean, there were some intelligence officers that I interviewed and gotten to know, and they're like, if we had left in 2003, we might have ended up where we did in 2020. And that he was depressed when he said that to me.
That's hard to square. Yeah.
And I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I don't disagree with it. I think the same thing. Like, I think hindsight 2020, Kosovo plus, right? I think that's what it would have, the response it was. And we went into even what you're talking about, going and toppling the Taliban. That's not even why we went into Afghanistan to begin with. It was just to dismantle an international terror organization named Al Qaeda with Western educated people with master's degrees, spoke multiple languages, highly technical, learned how to fly airplanes. Taliban can't even point to the United States on a map.
Right.
That's it. I mean, most of them cannot. Most of them are illiterate. They were doing their own thing as they've done for 5,000 years. That's just completely different than Arabs, who they would have viewed as pretty boys coming into there, using their land for Al Qaeda's purposes. That's not Taliban's purposes. And so even back then, I mean, it was a little bit muddy, I feel like.
So the question, I don't know if how do we continue to project power, and should we, in this 21st century? Like, what's the role of democracy? Can we export, quote, these values abroad? And we're being tested right now in Ukraine, right? I mean, this is to me, it's really about Europe and NATO, but I don't know. You've got a lot of interesting grist for the mill coming up in podcasts to come, as you know.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. It's, I feel like this downplays it sometimes. I don't mean that, but it's military history in the making on the global scale. So I've always thought it would be interesting to have, now be able to go back to World War II and see what the people experienced. And I think that's kind of what we'll look at here in 50 years is I think this is going to be one of those big conflicts, even if it stays regional, where people are going to wonder what it was like living through the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and we don't know, because Doug, you mentioned too, like how close World War II and Vietnam were in time. We forget. Press and I obviously weren't born, but that analogy of 20 years ago wasn't that long ago for us that were alive then, at least. The war itself is so early. It's so hard to know. Just months in. I mean, it took over 2 years for Pearl Harbor to happen for things to really escalate after Germany invaded Poland. 2 whole years. And we're just months in, and I think people are real antsy for a result or an outcome.
Right.
And it's just real hard to know when this stuff really happens over years of, a month is nothing. If this is the war that it is, because again, that's a big question too. It's obviously a different war, but it's also very similar to what we've seen in a lot of ways with proxy wars, NATO alliances. We're boating supplies over. I mean, there are a lot of parallels going on.
Yeah, we did a panel with about Ukraine at the National Writer Series, and I try to watch the news less and less.
Right.
Let's be honest with each other.
It hurts, yeah.
How do you process all of it? It's too much.
I wonder about the podcast. It's like we're talking about, I don't even know. It's like, do I need to learn more about this stuff and keep it in my brain? Am I better off just letting it go completely out of my brain? I don't need to know about any of it. If World War III happens and a nuke comes in and hits us, then it hits us and we're gone. It's whatever. And I didn't worry about it beforehand. And now it's all over anyway.
Well, I mean, when you go, I don't know what I'm going to write next. Maybe a musical comedy. A joke.
Yeah. Spice it up a little bit.
Yeah, I'm looking at your bookshelf behind you, Preston.
Oh man,
are you a fan of
it's almost all military history.
You guys do this on Zoom now? And ever see someone on a Zoom thing? You're looking at see what books they're reading. Isn't it kind of fun?
Well,
it is.
We have to mention before we wrap up. This is going to go on May 16th. So, am I correct that May 17th the re-release is coming out?
Yeah. With the new chapter of In Harm's Way, it's all the faults have been fixed, and it's quite a meaty bit of reporting I did for the new edition. 20 years on, and it still remains a really popular book, which is shocking to me because it's the first book I wrote.
It's awesome. So we'll link your website below, Doug, but anywhere else that people can find you or can reach out?
The website would be good, dougstanton.com. Facebook and Twitter, I guess. I don't read Facebook a lot these days, but they can try.
Got it. Website, Facebook, and Twitter. We'll put all that in the show description below. But Doug, thank you so much for taking the time. I didn't know what we were going to talk about because you've covered so much, but that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. It was, and good luck to you, and congratulations. Keep the faith in doing this. So if you ever get up north, call me.
Sounds like a plan.
Totally.
Even though you're a Buckeye, us Wolverines, we don't hold a grudge.
Yeah.
So.
I was about to say that. I did go to Ohio State too, so I am a Buckeye. But
yeah, but he's got
I love
a t-shirt
Michigan.
on. He's got a Mays t-shirt on, or a shirt.
It's University of Illinois. That's Champaign, Illinois, right there. Yeah.
Corn country.
All right, gentlemen.
Guys. Good luck to you.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Doug.
Bye-bye.